The Jewish community in Poland stretched back over 1,000 years. It experienced its golden ages, toleration, persecution, and rebirth. So, from the idea of Polin, Jewish cultural and educational renaissance, through to very dark times indeed. Join me, Jan Darasz, for How We Got Here.
Clutching a crowbar or a scrap of wood, we ask you, God, for a bloody battle. We beg you for a violent death. Spare us, before we die, the sight of slow receding rails. But give us, O Lord, a steady hand.
Jewish poet Władysław Szlęgiel wrote these words in hiding as one of the darkest chapters of Jewish history in Poland unfolded. The 1943 Warsaw Ghetto Uprising against their Nazi German oppressors. But Jews' relationship with Poland started long before those painful days, and it began as a story of hope. Fleeing scapegoating in Western and Central Europe for the spread of the Black Death in the mid-14th century, Jews found refuge in Poland. Polish King Kazimierz the Great welcomed the refugees, providing them with protection, religious freedom, limited taxation, and privileges, including the right to settle and conduct business. It is because of these tokens of tolerance that Poland earned its name among Jews. Polin, the land where you shall rest. But in the 16th century, with rising Catholic counter-reformation, the situation of Jews in Poland began to deteriorate. Perhaps even more devastating was the mid-17th century Cossack uprising of Bogdan Khmelnytsky, during which innumerable Jews were tortured, raped, and executed. Around 50,000 Jews, likely a conservative estimate, were killed during the revolt. Poland's declining political stability in the 18th century led to increased taxation and legal challenges for Jews. Their conditions worsened in Poland's Prussian and Russian partitions, while remaining moderate under the Habsburgs. Many Jews fought for Poland's independence in the later days of World War I, seeking a better future and becoming the country's second largest ethnic group, counting over 3 million people. In the interwar period, Jews experienced a polarized reality, with some rising to become the country's top artists, scientists, and entrepreneurs, while others suffered pogroms, university quotas, economic boycotts, and ensuing poverty. But the unfair treatment paled in comparison to what Poland's neighbour, the Nazi Third Reich, would bring upon Jews in Poland and across the continent.
I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Zachary Mazur. He's a historian from the Polish Academy of Science and also the Polin Museum of the History of Polish Jews. Welcome to the programme.
Thank you for having me.
And welcome once again. You were on programme number 1.
Yes.
All that long time ago. Our clip there showed the Polish king welcoming the Jews, but we talked before we came on air about a fascinating process by which the Jewish communities were expelled from Western Europe. And you mentioned this idea of people doing things, experiences as a group. Can you flesh out the way in which Jewish communities came from Western Europe into Poland?
Sure. So the Jews that end up living in what we know as Poland, sort of the Eastern European area, are all Ashkenazi Jews. Ashkenazi Jews originate from what is today northern France, western Germany, and they were settled there for periods of time and ended up mostly in cities. And as those cities gained the right to self-govern, what is called the Magdeburg Laws, they would oftentimes, throughout a process that's really started in the 12th century, they started to pass laws within their town that banned the settlement of Jews. And that meant that if there was any population of Jews, it could just be one family, they would expel them from the town.
And what was sorry to interrupt, what was the reason for this? Was it a doctrinal, was it a confessional reason, or was it economic tension between entrepreneurs and shopkeepers?
Yeah, so it can be both. So on the one hand, it can be a kind of commitment to an idea that if someone is not a believing Christian, that they are somehow a threat to their own faith. There is, of course, the common narrative that has been repeated over and over that the Jews killed Christ and therefore they should be hated and pushed out, right? But just going back to an important point that you made at the beginning, that we have to kind of shed our own understanding of the world as individuals who make choices for ourselves, and we make choices about where we want to live and how we want to live our lives and what jobs we want to do. This is a world in which none of that exists. You exist only as a member of a group. And so in that sense, you could be a member of the nobility, you could be a member of the clergy, a member of the peasantry, or a member of a minority group like the Jews. So the Jews as a minority group would be treated as a whole. And within the Jewish community, they had their own set of laws and courts and everything, their own autonomy, but that also meant that they as a group made arrangements with the higher powers, the majority powers, wherever they were living. That's a thing that is happening Europe-wide. And these arrangements then would come to a kind of expiration a lot of times in these German-speaking cities across kind of Central Europe. And a process that starts in the 12th century continues on into the 16th century. Many German cities are expelling Jews, and Jews start to move eastward. And as we saw in the beginning, there was this Edict of Toleration, and we get a couple of kind of key moments when Poles are welcoming Jews. But the really big difference is that Poland and then the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth are not centralized states. This is an area where
too big to
and this is an area where noble families, very, very wealthy noble families, owned entire fiefdoms, little countries within the country, right? And aside from big tracts of land where they were farming or forests or whatever, but they also owned towns. And as a part of that, they wanted to attract Jews to those towns to be the engines of economic activity for those towns. So a Jewish community would make an arrangement essentially with a noble family, and they would say, for example, okay, we're going to invite you into our town. Let's say it's Zamość, where the Zamoyski family was, right? They would invite them in and say, okay, you're going to be allowed to settle here, and you will have the right to raise your children how you want. You can practice your religion completely free from anything. We're going to allow you to print books also in your language, which was something that the Pope had banned, right? So in Italy, that was not allowed after a certain period. But in exchange, the Jews also had to pay taxes, they had to engage in trade, they had to engage in certain crafts, and they had to essentially do all of the work for the nobleman. There is a saying in Poland, szlachta nie pracuje. The noblemen don't work, right?
Yes.
So they really, really wanted these people to come in and do the work for them, to be the driving force for their wealth.
The community, the experience of that community reminds me of when I was younger, the expelling of the East Asian Ugandan from Idi Amin.
Yes.
Hong Kong Chinese, for example, very entrepreneurial class as we see them.
South Asians and East Asians played that same role in Africa. Yes.
Did the Jewish experience, being invited by the big aristocrats to stimulate economy, do we have figures? Do we have any evidence as to how it stimulated the Polish economy, then later the Polish-Lithuanian economy, by this symbiotic relationship?
Yeah, so the Jewish role in making the Polish-Lithuanian economy work was crucial. There was no way that any of this was going to work without them. And that was partly because of trade networks. They were the ones who were able to bring the grain from vast lands across Eastern Europe, bring them to a river, then to a port, and then export it to, let's say, Amsterdam, where it could be sold on the Western market. And that was an absolutely essential part of how the Polish noblemen gained their wealth throughout the 16th and up until the 18th century.
And were there any? Are we idealizing this Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth? By that I mean, do we see it as a golden age of the Polish economy, this age of tolerance? Was it actually as tolerant as we think, or was it just two, perhaps even three communities, the peasantry on the other hand, just rubbing along, tensions mounting, occasionally they flare up, then subside? Was it that sort of general picture?
Yeah, so I think from the 16th century up to the 18th century, this period is sometimes known, and even by contemporary commentators, as paradise for the Jews. We could say that it's paradise for the Jews. Everything is relative, right? Absolutely everything is relative. Was it paradise for the Jews? Probably not by our standards, but by the standards of Europe in those times, sure. It was one of the best places to be a Jew in the world at that time. And it's also relative to the other people around them. So Jews were relatively free. They could move from place to place. They could carry a sword. They had the right to make choices for themselves that peasants, for example, could not, right? So especially compared to the peasantry, they were extremely privileged in that way. But nonetheless, yes, of course, Jews also faced persecution, and they certainly were not free people in the way that we would like to think about ourselves today.
There was also tensions, for example, in places like Warsaw, with native craftsmen, native guilds being in contact, in conflict with the Jewish community, who was allowed to trade during Parliament, for example.
Of course, there were also tensions, and that also led to some towns that were previously tolerant all of a sudden making the decision to be intolerant of Jews, right, and kicking them out. Krakow is even an example of this, right? So we have Krakow and we have Kazimierz, the town just to the south that was given to the Jews by the king, but it also meant the expelling of the Jews from the center of Krakow, from what we would understand today as the old town of Krakow.
Yes, and if you gather together enough money, you could always bribe an aristocrat or the king to let you back in.
Sure, you could.
It's just the way it worked.
But a lot of times that meant converting. So what that would mean is essentially shedding your Jewishness in exchange for the privileges of a non-Jew.
What about there's a great thing that's, again, we look back to the 16th century, the Confederation of Warsaw. So it was the Jewish community, the Protestants, the Catholics, and they all made a pact to live together not to shed blood in the name of faith. Was it as noble as that, or were there practical reasons for doing that as well?
Yeah, I think that number one, it's usually an economic reason, right? Peace is good for business for the most part, and so it was more important for them to maintain a good relationship between these communities rather than having continued tensions and continued problems because of it.
And just before we go into our next clip, just what were the main centres of Jewish culture and education? We know about Lublin, Kraków. Were there any other places? What was the...
Well, so if we're thinking about up until the 18th century, we have a lot of really important centers, but Vilna is another one that you didn't mention there. Hugely important for a set of learned Jews. These were the Jews who really started the yeshiva movement. They were the ones who were thinking about book learning and really discussing Torah as a kind of scientific subject, is what we would understand as a kind of scientific subject. We also have leaders of Hasidic groups that are growing in the 18th century and becoming even more powerful as the 18th century goes on. And there's a bunch of different sort of houses of Hasidim. So right near Warsaw in Góra Kalwaria was known as Ger. That was also a really important center for Hasidic life, but there's a number of these centers where rebbes were sort of holding court.
So was this Jewish culture education fragmenting into different schools of thought or schools of worship?
Absolutely, yeah. So that's the process that's happening throughout the 18th century, is that there's a fragmenting of different movements about making Judaism into an official religion, right? As a kind of institutionalized religion. Sorry, that's the word I was looking for. But with that, then we have very different approaches. So the Hasidic movement is a very emotional movement. It's about feeling your faith. And as I mentioned, this Vilna group, associated mostly with the Vilna Gaon, the genius of Vilna, that group was called the Mitnagdim. They were the opponents. They were the ones who were opposing Hasidism, actually. And they were really focused on knowing your faith and as an intellectual exercise.
We have to move on, unfortunately, but we'll move on to our next clip.
Great.
Germany's invasion of Poland marked the beginning of one of the darkest chapters in Jewish history. The announcement of the so-called final solution at the Wannsee Conference 3 years later put Hitler's extermination machine into gear. At Auschwitz-Birkenau, Treblinka, Majdanek, and other concentration and death camps, Jews were put to back-breaking labour and killed in gas chambers. Jews who had been corralled into ghettos after the Nazi invasion of Warsaw, Łódź, Kraków, Białystok, and many other cities were put on trains and taken to the camps. Few of them survived. But the Jews of the Warsaw Ghetto rose up against their German oppressors on April 19, 1943. Led by Marek Edelman and Mordechai Anielewicz, the Jews fought a heroic but doomed rebellion. Around 300,000 Jews survived the terror of World War II, many hidden by Poles, others as Soviet evacuees, others still as partisans. Survivors often returned to Poland, hoping to rebuild their lives, but many faced anti-Semitic violence, such as the Kielce pogrom of 1946. Other Jewish survivors left for Israel, the US, or Western Europe. In communist Poland, a puppet state under Soviet control, Jewish cultural and religious life was suppressed. A second wave of Jewish immigration occurred when Polish Jews were allowed to leave in 1956-1957. 1968 saw the Polish Communist government launched an anti-Zionist purge, expelling about 15,000 Jews after accusing them of disloyalty. By 1989, fewer than 10,000 Jews remained in Poland. After the fall of communism in 1989, Poland experienced a Jewish cultural revival. The Polin Museum of the History of Polish Jews opened in 2013, becoming a major institution preserving Jewish history. Festivals like the Kraków Jewish Cultural Festival gained popularity, drawing audiences from all over the world. Poland's Jewish population today is estimated at about 10 to 20,000 people, but the real number could be higher, as many Poles are discovering Jewish ancestry that their parents and grandparents had kept secret for decades, fearing prosecution.
We are commemorating the anniversary of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising of 1943. What were the myths that have arisen from this event, and how does it influence current Israeli, Jewish, non-Jewish historiography and thinking about this 1943 month?
So 1943 is the biggest moment of Jewish resistance throughout the Second World War. It's one of the very first mass armed pieces of resistance that we could even talk about during World War II against Nazi occupation. So it's a hugely important moment, but it's also within a very difficult context. The Warsaw Ghetto was enormous. We had over 300,000, almost up to 400,000 at its peak, people living in a crowded area. And throughout the existence of the Warsaw Ghetto, there were periods of sickness and starvation. People were dying. And then there was also, of course, the period starting in the summer of 1942, when there was a massive campaign to basically wipe out everyone within the Warsaw Ghetto, ship them off to Treblinka, and that all happens very, very quickly. So the period of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising happens within a kind of strange time when the Warsaw Ghetto is rather empty. We've gone now down to less than 50,000 people who are living in this area, and these are people who have endured really the most horrible things that you can imagine. They've lost their family, their friends, they're despondent in all kinds of ways. And then in January 1943, there's an attempt to clear the ghetto, and there is sparse resistance coming from Jewish fighting groups that really surprises the Nazis. And at that point, there is a moment of hope. So people all of a sudden feel like, oh, wait, maybe there's a way that we can fight back. And then the Nazis come back in April 19th, and that is when the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising begins. One of the myths, perhaps, that is there is that we might think, okay, we have 50,000 people left, they're desperate, maybe all of them are fighting. No, it's really about less than 1,000 people who are fighting. And it's not because they didn't want to fight necessarily, it was about a lack of weapons. But the other issue that we're dealing with is a society that is completely atomized. People are looking to save themselves and are not necessarily working together. And it's those people who are working within a political party, within a scouting group, or some kind of other existing network of society. Those are the people who join together and are able to do something bigger. Those are the people who are out there fighting.
And there were two major organizations within the ghetto themselves. There was
the Jewish Fighting Organization
and the Jewish Military Union. Yes.
Yeah.
Why was the first one stressed and not the latter? The latter's coming back into being evaluated.
Yes.
But generally, it was that one. It's the first one that we're talking about, the Jewish Fighting.
Yeah. So the Jewish Fighting Organization, on the one hand, was a union of a bunch of different parties. So we had the whole spectrum of political ideas there, from socialist to right-wing Zionist. The other organization that we were talking about, the Jewish Union, Military Union, was specifically from the revisionist Zionists. So revisionist Zionists were far-right Zionists, kind of extremist Zionists who were inspired by Mussolini and some of the fascist movements of the 1920s and 30s. And they were already kind of militarized even in the 1930s. And that group grew out of the Beitar youth group of that political party. And they wanted nothing to do with those other Jewish groups. They were extremist in that way, right? And the reason why we know much less about them is quite simple. It's that no one survived. Yeah. We have 0 survivors, and we know basically nothing about what happened to them during the uprising or after the uprising. For the other group, for the Jewish Fighting Organization, we have obviously very few, but there are some survivors, and there are some people who can tell us something about that. They also left behind records, and we can also look at exactly what was happening throughout that month from April 19th.
And we know that it failed, but how did it influence the historiography of the Jewish experience in the Second World War? Okay, we know about the great Holocaust that happened, but this localized event, how did that influence, for example, the Israeli attitude to Europe, to its own history?
Yeah, so it's a hugely important moment for the Jewish memory of the Holocaust, because we have this myth that the Jews went to the slaughter like lambs, right? That there was absolutely no thought, no resistance at all against what was happening to them. And obviously, this is a big example where we can say, no, that's not true, right? People actually did fight. They took up arms. They did things that were trying to prevent the Nazis from carrying out their plan of extermination of the Jews. But it's one part of resistance. There is much more to resistance than that. There is just the act of trying to stay alive every single day. Those were also acts of resistance. So there were plenty of other people who did things that would be in the category of violent resistance, and we know nothing about them because they didn't succeed. They did something violent, they were killed, end of story. We have no record of that, right? But for Israel, the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising is hugely important. The date on the Jewish calendar in which that took place is Yom HaShoah. It is the day of the Holocaust in Israel. It is a moment when everyone stops. It's almost like the Warsaw Uprising here, where we have the sirens and people have a moment of silence in September, right?
A final question to you, Dr. Mazur. How does the Jewish community, how is it composed? What does it look like? How does it worship in Poland today? Has it gone from this major influence in Polish history to a minor group? How would you paint us a picture of the Jewish presence back in Poland?
Jewish identity today in Poland is extremely complex. Even trying to figure out who is Jewish within Poland is extremely complex. And there is a fight over how many Jews. There's a number between 5,000 and 15,000, depending on how you want to count it. But nonetheless, there is a diverse group of Jews who are still practicing the whole range from Reform to Conservative and Hasidic are worshiping and existing in Poland today, but mostly in the major cities. So in Krakow, Warsaw, we have these communities. But for the most part, I would say that being Jewish and being openly Jewish is not necessarily something that that someone wants to emphasize. It is just sort of a part of their background, so it doesn't need to define who they are.
Yeah. We only have half an hour, unfortunately, but thank you very much, Dr. Mazur, for coming to the programme.
Thank you for having me.
Fascinating discussion. That's all we have time for. Do join us next time. That's to say Tuesdays at 9:35 p.m, 21:35. Join us then.